truth was just beginning.
January 17, 1944. Dawn crept over the Pacific coastline, painting the sky in pale gold. The faint hum of distant engines grew louder, a pulse that made the ground tremble. On a Japanese airfield hidden in the hills, engineers and officers gathered, clutching reports and blueprints. One man, a senior aircraft engineer, frowned over the pages. His calculations, his assumptions, had all pointed to a simple truth. America had no aluminum. They could not possibly produce thousands of high-performance fighters. Yet, from the horizon, the sky darkened with movement. Silver silhouettes of P-51 Mustangs streaked across the sunlit clouds, their engines roaring like unleashed beasts. The ground shook beneath the weight of disbelief. For decades, Japan had underestimated American industrial might. But in that moment, reality could not be denied. The Mustang sliced through the sky with precision and speed, a perfect testament to mass production and technological innovation. Each plane reflected sunlight, each engine a defiance of expectation. And for the engineer, staring upward, there was only one thought. They had been wrong. Terribly, unimaginably wrong. The air was alive with inevitability, a turning point waiting to unfold. By 1943, the Pacific War had reached a pivotal phase. Japan's expansion across Southeast Asia and the Pacific had slowed. Early victories in the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies had given way to attritional battles against a growing American industrial juggernaut. The Imperial Japanese Navy, once confident in its ability to project power, faced increasing shortages of raw materials. Aluminum, critical for aircraft production, was scarce. Mines were limited, smelters vulnerable, and Allied blockades choked supply lines. Japanese engineers, officers, and planners grew increasingly anxious. How could Japan compete against a foe capable of producing aircraft in quantities far beyond their imagination? Across the Pacific, the United States had entered a phase of extraordinary industrial mobilization. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, American factories had transformed overnight. Automobile plants became aircraft assembly lines. Steel mills, once focused on peacetime production, now poured out the materials necessary for mass aviation. By mid-1943, the U.S. was producing thousands of fighters each month. Among these, the North American P-51 Mustang emerged as a game-changer, a sleek, fast, long-range fighter designed to escort bombers deep into enemy territory. The P-51's development had been deliberate and technically ambitious. Initially conceived as the NA-73 for the British, the Mustang incorporated an airframe optimized for speed and maneuverability. Early versions with Allison engines performed well at low altitudes but struggled at the heights where bomber formations flew. The introduction of the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine transformed the aircraft into a high-altitude predator. With a maximum speed exceeding 440 miles per hour and a combat radius that allowed escort missions far over enemy territory, the Mustang embodied the combination of American industrial capacity and engineering ingenuity. Japan, constrained by material shortages, could not imagine the scale of American production. Reports from intelligence units often underestimated the number of aircraft being built or the speed at which factories could turn out new designs. Some engineers calculated that it would take years, perhaps decades, for the U.S. to field the numbers necessary to dominate air combat. In the minds of Japanese planners, America might possess advanced technology, but it lacked the raw materials and assembly capacity to field fleets of modern fighters in the Pacific. Meanwhile, the U.S. was already reshaping its tactical doctrine. Long-range bombers like the B-17 Flying Fortress and later the B-29 Superfortress required escorts to survive deep raids over enemy territory. Without fighters capable of protecting them from interception, these bombers were vulnerable. Enter the Mustang, a long-range escort fighter capable of accompanying bombers to targets that had once seemed untouchable. Its aluminum skin, powerful engine, and aerodynamic design allowed unprecedented speed, maneuverability, and range. Japanese reconnaissance occasionally sighted these aircraft during test flights or in small engagements, but the numbers were misleading. A dozen planes here, 20 there, never the waves of hundreds that would soon appear. Japanese engineers relied on reports of few production models, reinforcing their belief in American scarcity. Calculations on paper suggested that mass deployment of advanced aircraft was impossible without a massive industrial backbone, and Japan, still recovering from years of war expansion, assumed the Americans were limited in this regard. By late 1943, the stage was set. The Japanese military clung to assumptions rooted in reality, but distorted by scarcity. American factories, however, operated with relentless efficiency. Assembly lines in California, Michigan, and Texas churned out thousands of aluminum airframes fitted with engines and armaments and shipped via convoy to the Pacific Theater. Every crate of parts, every completed Mustang, was a testament to a nation capable of turning raw material into instruments of strategic dominance. As the Japanese engineer stared at his reports noting the lack of aluminum and the supposed limitations of the U.S., he was unaware that the next months would expose the fallacy of every assumption. From the skies above, silver wings would appear, moving faster, farther, and in numbers that no paper calculation had allowed him to predict. The world was about to demonstrate a painful truth. American industrial might was beyond comprehension, and the skies over Japan were about to bear witness. The tension between expectation and reality set the stage for a confrontation that would leave Japanese engineers and commanders alike in disbelief. A confrontation that would redefine air combat in the Pacific. Early 1944 marked the crescendo of Japan's strategic miscalculations. Their intelligence network, though extensive, had critical blind spots. Reconnaissance flights over the Aleutians, the Marshall Islands, and even glimpses of American shipyards revealed activity. But the scale was deceptive. A few rows of aircraft on a runway suggested limited production. The full output, hidden behind factory walls and dispersed across multiple states, was invisible to prying eyes. Japanese engineers and military planners were convinced the United States could build fighters, but not in the thousands needed to dominate the Pacific skies. This misjudgment extended to raw materials. Aluminum, essential for high-performance aircraft, was perceived as scarce in America. Japanese reports noted smelters in the U.S., but assumed that the demands of civil industry and the Atlantic conflict would limit output. In reality, American factories had transformed aluminum production into a war engine. Massive hydroelectric plants in the Pacific Northwest powered smelters capable of producing tens of thousands of tons annually. Entire transportation networks moved aluminum sheets, rivets, and components to assembly lines in record time. The logistical precision was unmatched, a hidden arsenal that Japanese analysts could not quantify. Within Japan, the constraints of war were stark. Fuel shortages, bombing raids on industrial centers, and stretched supply lines left factories struggling to maintain even modest aircraft production. The Mitsubishi A6M0, once the apex of naval air superiority, was increasingly outmatched by newer American designs. Aluminum scarcity forced compromises, lighter airframes, reduced armament, and limited production runs. Engineers worked tirelessly, improvising solutions to a problem that had no easy fix. They had assumed that American limitations would compensate for their own deficiencies, but reality was shifting faster than they could measure. Meanwhile, in the United States, aircraft production accelerated at an almost unfathomable pace. By January 1944, the North American P-51 Mustang program was in full swing. Assembly lines produced dozens of aircraft per day, with standardized processes and modular construction allowing rapid replacement of parts and continuous expansion of production. Every component, from engine to propeller to aluminum wing panel, was meticulously designed for mass manufacture without compromising performance. The Mustang was no longer a prototype. It was a weapon of war in quantity, quality, and efficiency simultaneously. Intelligence reports reaching Japan often focused on qualitative analysis, what the aircraft could do, rather than quantitative capacity. Engineers and officers debated performance specifications, structural integrity, and combat effectiveness, but rarely grasped the true volume being produced. Miscalculations were compounded by underestimation of American logistics. Ports, railways, and air transport networks enabled the movement of completed Mustangs to the front lines faster than any Japanese countermeasure could track. The perception gap widened with every shipment of aircraft that crossed the Pacific, unseen, unchallenged, and entirely beyond Japan's predictive models. By early 1944, American long-range bombers had begun penetrating the outer defenses of Japanese-held territories. B-17S and B-29S, previously vulnerable, now traveled with Mustang escorts. These escorts did more than protect. They hunted Japanese fighters, forcing them into defensive maneuvers, disrupting formations, and steadily eroding morale. For engineers back in Japan, the first sightings of Mustangs were almost surreal. Reports described fast silver planes, appearing in numbers previously thought impossible, and for many, disbelief was the first reaction. The stage was set for a collision between expectation and reality. Japanese planners had calculated scarcity. American production ensured abundance. Japanese engineers had assumed limits. American ingenuity imposed no ceiling. And as the first squadrons of Mustangs roared over Japanese skies, the limitations of intelligence, the fallibility of assumptions, and the sheer weight of industrial capacity would become undeniable. The gulf between prediction and reality was not abstract. It was measurable, brutal, and immediate. The Japanese had assumed they could match, adapt, and survive against a constrained opponent. The truth, as the silver Mustangs sliced through dawn skies, was far more unforgiving. And this realization, both shocking and catastrophic, would shape the angles through which this story is told: human, technological, tactical, and moral. In the quiet of Japanese engineering offices, disbelief hung heavier than the winter air. Senior engineers, men who had devoted decades to the study of aircraft and materials science, stared at reconnaissance reports with a mounting sense of incredulity. One report marked priority urgent, detailed sightings of silver fighters in unprecedented numbers. The P-51 Mustangs were not prototypes. They were operational, mass-produced, and appearing in waves across the Pacific. For the Japanese engineers, trained to calculate limits, this was unthinkable. Their minds sought an explanation, perhaps exaggeration, perhaps error, but the photographs, pilot accounts, and intercepted radio transmissions left no room for doubt. The human reaction to this reality was a blend of awe and fear. Pride in their own engineering accomplishments gave way to the stark understanding that the enemy had surpassed them, not only in technological design but in sheer scale of execution. The Mustang's introduction changed the tactical landscape of air warfare over the Pacific. Previously, Japanese fighters could engage American bombers with relative impunity, relying on speed, maneuverability, and anti-aircraft coordination. The Mustang, however, redefined the calculus. Long-range escort missions now allowed American bombers to reach Japanese-held territories with support throughout the entire flight. Mustangs intercepted Japanese fighters far from their bases, striking before they could concentrate, and then melted back to bomber formations with agility that Japanese pilots struggled to match. Air superiority was no longer a contested domain. It became a strategic tool. Tactics once considered effective were rendered obsolete overnight. Japanese commanders faced a dilemma: disperse forces to cover multiple fronts or risk mass losses. The P-51 Mustang represented an apex of wartime aviation engineering. Its airframe, constructed primarily from aluminum, combined lightness with structural strength, allowing exceptional speed without compromising durability. The Merlin engine, licensed from Britain, delivered high-altitude performance that gave the Mustang the power to climb above intercepting fighters while maintaining long-range capability. Innovations like the laminar flow wing minimized drag and maximized fuel efficiency, further extending operational reach. Every element, from armament placement to cockpit ergonomics, reflected a synthesis of design intelligence and production pragmatism. For Japanese engineers, the Mustang was both a marvel and a nightmare. A machine built not just to win battles, but to do so consistently and in overwhelming numbers. Allied leadership understood the strategic potential of the Mustang. Decisions by figures like General Henry Hap Arnold and Air Chief Marshal Carl Spaatz focused on exploiting this technological edge. By directing Mustangs to escort bombers on the longest and riskiest missions, American commanders ensured that every sortie projected both firepower and psychological dominance. The careful coordination of fighter wings, bomber groups, and intelligence units created a network in which the Mustang's speed and range became force multipliers. On the Japanese side, leaders like Admiral Minichi Koga and General Masakazu Kawabe struggled to adapt. Orders to disperse air assets, reinforce vulnerable bases, or prioritize new intercept tactics came too late. Decisions that might have mitigated losses collided with the stark reality of American production capability. Japanese pilots faced a new reality in the skies. The Zero, once considered the apex of dogfighting, now contended with an aircraft that could climb faster, dive harder, and outgun it at higher altitudes. The psychological impact was immediate. Pilots reported fear and disbelief at the sight of silver Mustangs appearing seemingly from nowhere, executing maneuvers they could not counter. Anti-aircraft gunners struggled to adjust to the Mustang's speed. Ground controllers attempted to coordinate interceptions, but the combination of range, maneuverability, and American numerical superiority rendered many efforts futile. The enemy was no longer merely an opponent. It was a manifestation of industrial power transformed into tactical precision. Each of these angles, human, tactical, technological, leadership, and enemy, intertwines to form a mosaic of understanding. The Japanese engineers' initial disbelief reflects the human dimension. The Mustang's operational deployment illustrates tactical and technological mastery. Command decisions shape outcomes, and the enemy's experience underscores the psychological and practical consequences of overwhelming force. Together, they frame the story of a sky full of Mustangs and the shockwaves that would ripple through Japan's perception of the war. The appearance of the Mustang over Japanese skies did more than reshape tactics. It struck at the moral and psychological core of both engineers and pilots. Men who had once believed in their own ingenuity now confronted a reality where quantity and speed outweighed precision and tradition. Reports of squadron after squadron of Mustangs, each escorted by identical wings, circulated rapidly among officers. Fear was tempered by professional admiration. Japanese pilots recognized the aircraft's brilliance even as it threatened their survival. Diaries and memoirs from the period describe a pervasive sense of unease. No longer could they fight battles in familiar patterns. Every sortie was now a contest against overwhelming industrial and logistical might. This psychological shock would echo through subsequent engagements, influencing decisions, morale, and the willingness to confront American forces directly. The Mustang's dominance was inseparable from the industrial backbone that supported them. Each aircraft represented more than aluminum and engines. It was a product of a vast coordinated system of factories, supply lines, and skilled labor. American shipyards, railways, and ports ensured the rapid movement of parts, while assembly lines maintained unprecedented efficiency. Every Mustang in the sky was a tangible manifestation of U.S. industrial supremacy. A weapon born not only of engineering but of logistics, manpower, and resource allocation on an extraordinary scale. Japanese strategists had assumed that scarcity and logistical constraints would limit American deployment. The reality of mass production proved otherwise. Strategically, the Mustangs allowed the Allies to enforce air superiority, protect bombing missions, and eventually shape the trajectory of the Pacific War itself. The Japanese high command faced decisions under pressure. Admirals and generals scrambled to adjust tactics, shifting fighters to intercept positions and reinforcing anti-aircraft defenses. Yet, each decision was constrained by the limits of Japanese industry and material shortages. Aircraft production could not match losses, fuel was scarce, and trained pilots were finite. In contrast, American leadership leveraged their resources to maximize the impact of every Mustang sortie. Coordination between bomber groups and escort squadrons, combined with intelligence on Japanese movements, allowed U.S. commanders to concentrate firepower precisely where it mattered. Leadership decisions on both sides thus became a contest of vision versus reality, a test of how effectively commanders could harness the tools at their disposal. American pilots underwent rigorous training to exploit the Mustang's capabilities fully. Long-range navigation, formation flying, and gunnery exercises ensured that each Mustang wing could operate with near-perfect cohesion. In contrast, Japanese pilots, accustomed to dogfighting tactics optimized for older aircraft like the Zero, struggled to adapt. The Mustang's superior speed and altitude performance made traditional maneuvers risky, forcing pilots to develop new tactics on the fly. Reports from the field describe frantic evasions, split formations, and desperate attempts to engage an enemy that could dictate when and where combat occurred. Training, once a constant, now collided with a dynamic threat whose very presence redefined the battlefield. Although not directly in combat, civilians felt the impact of the Mustang's dominance. As bombers escorted by Mustangs penetrated deeper into Japanese territory, the possibility of air raids reached unprecedented levels. Industrial cities, transport hubs, and coastal towns recognized the new reality. The war had escalated from naval engagements and limited raids to sustained aerial operations supported by technologically superior fighters. Civilians, like the engineers and pilots, experienced the shock of a power once underestimated, an industrial and military machine now capable of reaching every corner of their nation. Through these angles, the narrative comes into sharper focus: the human shock, the tactical transformation, technological marvel, leadership challenges, strategic implications, adaptation struggles, and civilian awareness all converge. They tell a story not merely of machines in the sky, but of perception, fear, ingenuity, and the stark reality of industrialized warfare. The Japanese engineer who once believed America had no aluminum now understood the magnitude of what he faced. And with that realization, the stage was set for the climactic turning point, a moment when these elements would collide with decisive force. Spring 1944. The first full-scale Mustang escort missions began over Japanese-held islands in the Pacific. Dawn broke over the Mariana Archipelago, illuminating coral atolls and airfields, as waves of B-17 and B-29 bombers prepared to penetrate deeper into enemy territory. On the Japanese side, radar operators and spotters squinted at the horizon, counting the approaching silhouettes. A strange feeling rippled through the ranks. The number of aircraft seemed impossible. They were correct, but impossible had become real. On March 15, 1944, a formation of 72 Mustangs flying in tight echelon escorted 48 B-17s towards strategic targets near Truk Atoll. Japanese Zero fighters scrambled, attempting to intercept, but the Mustang's superior speed, combined with their ability to climb and dive with precision, allowed them to engage without risking the bombers. In minutes, the sky became a theater of motion, silver planes streaking past tropical clouds, gunfire tracing lines of smoke through the air, Japanese pilots struggling to respond. Reports from the field describe Zeros being caught off guard, forced into defensive spirals, and often retreating after a single pass. The human drama was unmistakable. For the Japanese engineer who had once calculated the limits of American production, the reports arriving via field dispatches confirmed his worst fears. Entire squadrons were neutralized in minutes. Airfields that had been considered secure now felt vulnerable. Pilots, both American and Japanese, pushed aircraft to the limits. Mustang engines screamed at maximum RPM, wings cut through sunlight, and gun barrels sparked over Pacific waters. Air controllers on the ground tracked engagements with disbelief, tallying losses that would have been unthinkable just months before. The Mustang's presence altered every encounter. Japanese anti-aircraft batteries opened fire, but their guns, calibrated for older, slower aircraft, often overshot or fell behind the relentless speed of the Mustangs. Bomber formations, once vulnerable, now advanced with confidence. The tactical superiority of the Mustang allowed U.S. forces not only to protect bombers, but to dictate the tempo of engagements. Japanese forces, once capable of initiating ambushes or dictating combat ranges, were forced onto the defensive. Every sortie demonstrated a widening gap between expectation and reality, between Japanese assumptions and American industrial capability. Specific engagements highlighted the decisive nature of the Mustang's introduction. On March 21, 1944, during a sweep over the Truk Atoll naval installations, Mustangs intercepted a squadron of 36 Zeros attempting to disrupt a bombing run. In the ensuing 15 minutes, the Mustangs downed or damaged over half the intercepting fighters without a single bomber lost. Reports from surviving Japanese pilots described a sky filled with impossible silver birds, machines that moved faster than any reconnaissance aircraft had suggested. For the Japanese high command, the calculations that had guided strategy for years no longer applied. Behind the numbers, human responses painted the full picture. American pilots recalled the exhilaration of sweeping past enemy formations, the grim satisfaction of completing a mission without bomber losses, and the realization that industrial power had become a weapon as decisive as guns or bombs. Japanese pilots, conversely, faced panic, frustration, and exhaustion. The Mustang had redefined the rules of engagement. It was no longer a contest of skill alone, but a confrontation against production capacity, technological innovation, and tactical planning executed flawlessly. This first phase of Mustang deployment marked the beginning of a new era over the Pacific. Air superiority was no longer tenuous. It was becoming systemic. The Japanese engineer, once confident that America lacked the material to produce fighters in mass, now faced a stark truth. The sky would soon be filled with Mustangs in numbers beyond comprehension. And in that realization lay the seeds of strategic collapse, an understanding that production, precision, and persistence had combined to deliver a weapon whose presence alone altered the course of battle. As the first squadrons returned to their bases, engines smoking and pilots fatigued yet victorious, the implications were unmistakable. Japan's assumptions had been shattered. The sky, once contested and uncertain, now belonged to a force whose scale and speed exceeded all previous calculations. The next stage, the continuation of decisive engagements and the full impact on Japanese defenses, would cement the turning point in the Pacific Air War. By April 1944, Mustang operations over Japanese-held territories had become routine and devastating. The Pacific skies, once dotted with occasional enemy aircraft, now thrummed with relentless activity. American squadrons executed long-range missions with precision. Mustangs escorted B-17 and B-29s to distant targets, ensuring minimal losses and maximum impact. Japanese pilots, though skilled and courageous, increasingly found themselves outmatched in both technology and numbers. The psychological weight of facing aircraft that could strike at will and vanish left many unsteady before takeoff. A critical engagement occurred on April 12, 1944, over the island of Saipan. Intelligence had reported an incoming bomber raid of moderate size, but the Japanese interception force underestimated the Mustang escort. 45 Mustangs, arranged in tight formations, intercepted 50 Japanese fighters attempting to engage the bombers. The Mustangs struck first, diving from higher altitudes and utilizing energy tactics that allowed them to attack, while maintaining speed and altitude advantage. Within 20 minutes, over half of the Japanese interceptors were destroyed or damaged, while American bombers continued unscathed. Reports noted the almost mechanical efficiency of Mustang pilots, trained to exploit every advantage of their aircraft. On the ground, Japanese air commanders faced a stark reality. Airfields had been lost, aircraft destroyed on runways, and replacements could not arrive fast enough to compensate. Engineers who had once calculated limits for American production now confronted evidence of sustained, large-scale deployment. Every Mustang sortie reinforced the message. Japan's previous assumptions about material scarcity were catastrophically wrong. Industrial output, pilot training, and logistical coordination combined to deliver a force that could strike repeatedly without faltering. The human dimension of these engagements was profound. For American pilots, the adrenaline of combat was tempered by the strategic significance of each victory. Each interception preserved bomber lives, maintained air superiority, and demonstrated the United States' ability to sustain pressure over vast distances. Japanese pilots, by contrast, endured a mounting sense of futility. The Zero, agile and venerable, could not match the Mustang at altitude. Attempts at massed formations often failed under coordinated attacks, and every encounter exacted heavy losses. Morale eroded as airmen faced the repeated evidence that superior technology, backed by industry, had decisively shifted the balance. The turning point crystallized in late April 1944. Mustang squadrons began conducting offensive sweeps independent of bomber formations, seeking out Japanese airfields and patrols before they could launch intercepts. Intelligence units tracked each sortie meticulously, noting the expanding operational range and the frequency of missions. For Japan, the strategic implications were terrifying. The war in the air was no longer a contest of skill, surprise, or numerical parity. It had become a battle of endurance against an enemy who could replace losses faster than they could be inflicted. By May, Japanese assessments admitted what had long been unthinkable. The United States possessed the capacity to produce and deploy aircraft in numbers and quality that Japan could not match. The P-51 Mustang, once merely an experimental fighter, had become a symbol of industrial supremacy, a machine that combined speed, range, firepower, and reliability in a package that Japan had assumed impossible. Engineers, officers, and pilots alike recognized the magnitude of the error in prior assumptions. A single glance at the sky, filled with silver Mustangs performing synchronized maneuvers, was enough to communicate a fundamental truth. The balance of air power had shifted irrevocably. These decisive engagements culminated not only in tactical victories but in the broader reorientation of the Pacific War. The Japanese defensive strategy had relied on attrition, dispersal, and the hope that American production could be limited. The reality of Mustang operations shattered these calculations. Each successful escort mission, each downed Japanese fighter, and each bomber that reached its target without loss reinforced the notion that American industrial capacity had become a weapon in itself. As the smoke cleared over islands like Saipan, Truk, and the Marianas, the evidence was irrefutable. Japan's previous assessments of scarcity, calculations of capability, and predictions of American limitations were exposed as dangerously incomplete. The sky, once a contested battlefield, now bore witness to the undeniable consequence of unchecked industrial might. And with this turning point established, the stage was set for the aftermath. The losses, strategic shifts, and psychological toll that would shape the final chapters of the air war over Japan. The months following the first widespread Mustang operations over Japanese skies revealed the devastating consequences of underestimating industrial power. Losses mounted for Japanese air units, not only in aircraft but in trained pilots whose experience could not be replaced. Airfields, once thought secure, became targets themselves. Bombing raids escorted by Mustangs inflicted structural damage on hangars, supply depots, and fuel storage, eroding Japan's ability to respond effectively. Reports from April and May 1944 indicate that entire squadrons were wiped out on single sorties, while American formations returned largely intact. The numbers were stark. On Saipan, during successive escort missions in April, Japanese forces lost nearly half of their defending aircraft in engagements lasting under 30 minutes. Similar encounters at Truk and the Marianas reported attrition rates that Japanese strategists had never anticipated. Even when pilots survived, aircraft damaged in combat often remained grounded due to limited repair capacity. Japan's industrial bottlenecks, aluminum scarcity, limited production lines, and fuel constraints meant that replacements could not arrive at the pace demanded by the evolving air war. In contrast, U.S. production lines maintained an almost continuous output of Mustangs, B-17, and later B-29s, reinforcing the gap between expectation and reality. Beyond the tactical losses, the psychological toll was profound. Pilots and engineers who had once calculated that American resources were insufficient to threaten Japanese air dominance now confronted the opposite truth. Diaries and testimonies describe feelings of shock and disbelief among both ground crews and airmen. A senior Japanese engineer, writing after the engagements, reflected on the impossibility of predicting such a sustained and technologically superior onslaught. The realization that America's industrial capacity could, and would, manifest repeatedly in the skies undermined confidence and sapped morale. Strategically, the impact was equally significant. The U.S. achieved air superiority over critical Pacific islands, enabling bombing campaigns to proceed with minimal loss. Targets that had been considered beyond reach, such as industrial centers and naval installations, could now be struck regularly. This shift forced Japan to redistribute fighters, redeploy anti-aircraft units, and attempt countermeasures that were reactive rather than proactive. Every engagement highlighted the growing imbalance. The United States could sustain operations indefinitely, while Japan struggled to maintain even modest resistance. Moreover, the Mustang's presence revealed the limitations of Japanese intelligence and planning. Prior reports emphasizing scarcity of American aluminum, doubts about production capacity, and assumptions regarding logistical constraints had guided strategic decisions for months. Each Mustang sortie proved these calculations wrong. demonstrating that industrial scale and innovation were decisive factors in modern warfare. For Japanese commanders, the gap between what had been predicted and what was now visible in the sky could not be bridged by skill or courage alone. Civilian populations indirectly affected also experienced the consequences. Bombing raids supported by Mustangs increased the reach and effectiveness of attacks on urban and industrial centers. Coastal towns, shipyards, and manufacturing hubs faced threats that had previously seemed distant. The psychological impact on civilians, already under strain from years of war, mirrored the shock experienced by pilots and engineers. The sky was no longer a protective ceiling. It had become a domain dominated by a seemingly limitless industrial force. In sum, the immediate aftermath of Mustang operations exposed a harsh reality. Losses in personnel and aircraft, the collapse of previously secure defensive positions, and the psychological shock of confronting superior industrial power reshaped the Pacific Air War. Japan, forced to confront the consequences of miscalculated assumptions and underestimated production, faced a rapidly narrowing set of options. The next phase, broader strategic consequences, shifts in military planning, and the long-term effects on the Pacific Campaign, would cement the Mustang's legacy as a decisive instrument in the Allied victory. As the weeks turned into months, the cumulative effect of Mustang operations reshaped the Pacific theater. Japan's air defenses, once formidable, were steadily eroded. Anti-aircraft batteries, strained by repeated engagements, could no longer prevent bomber incursions. Airfields were damaged or destroyed, and replacement aircraft lagged far behind losses. The once respected Zero, symbol of Japanese aerial prowess, could no longer contest the skies with consistency. Each sortie reinforced a simple truth. American industrial capacity, combined with technological innovation, had created an insurmountable advantage. Operational reports highlight the scale of the shift. By mid-1944, Mustang squadrons escorted thousands of bombers over Japanese-held islands and the home islands themselves. The combined effect of fighter protection and offensive sweeps reduced American bomber losses to fractions of earlier campaigns. Meanwhile, Japanese pilots faced increasing attrition. Experienced airmen, critical to maintaining effective defense, were lost in engagements that their aircraft and training could not counter. Training programs struggled to replace them, but even fresh pilots, no matter how skilled, could not compensate for the technological and numerical gap. The strategic consequences extended beyond individual battles. Japanese commanders realized that previous assumptions about American limitations were catastrophically flawed. Air defense strategies that relied on attrition or misjudged production capacity failed to anticipate the sustained pressure the Mustangs allowed. Commanders attempted tactical adaptations, dispersing aircraft, fortifying key positions, and concentrating interceptors, but each adjustment was reactive, never preemptive. The industrial advantage of the United States meant that each loss could be replaced swiftly, while Japan's constrained resources limited its ability to recover from setbacks. The psychological and moral dimensions were equally profound. Memoirs and diaries from Japanese engineers and pilots describe disbelief and fear as waves of silver fighters dominated the skies. One officer recounted watching a formation of Mustangs appear like a river of steel across the sunlit horizon, realizing immediately that Japan's calculations had failed. Ground crews, responsible for repairing damaged aircraft, faced the dual pressures of repeated air raids and diminishing resources. Morale, both in the air and on the ground, declined steadily, influencing subsequent operational decisions and contributing to a defensive posture increasingly defined by caution rather than initiative. Civilian perception of the war also shifted. The presence of Mustangs escorting bombers over territories close to Japan's home islands revealed a new dimension of reach. Previously distant conflicts now carried the potential for direct threat to urban and industrial areas. Newspapers, leaflets, and intercepted communications circulated among the population, conveying that the enemy could project power relentlessly, sustained by production capacity previously considered impossible. Fear and uncertainty became as much a tool of strategic advantage as bullets and bombs. Reports from Allied intelligence further reinforced the disparity. Captured documents, intercepted transmissions, and reconnaissance confirmed the sheer volume of American production. Estimates suggested that the United States could sustain aircraft deployment at levels far beyond Japan's ability to counter. Every Mustang in the sky, every bomber successfully escorted, became proof of an industrial system transformed into a strategic weapon. The gulf between American capability and Japanese perception was now painfully visible. By late 1944, the consequences were clear. Japan's earlier calculations of scarcity, production limits, and technological parity had collapsed. Air superiority had shifted decisively into Allied hands, allowing bombing campaigns to proceed with greater precision, reduced risk, and increasing psychological effect. The Mustang was not merely a fighter. It had become a symbol of an industrial and technological reality that Japan could not hope to match. The stage was now set for reflection. The broader significance of this turning point, both for the conduct of war and for historical understanding, awaited calm, deliberate contemplation. The sight of a sky filled with Mustangs was more than a tactical revelation. It was a statement about the nature of modern warfare. Japan's engineers had calculated limits, measured scarcity, and assumed that industrial constraints would shield them from overwhelming force.
Did you check
The
tension on the
reality,
torque wrench?
as dawn
Yes, it's
broke over
calibrated. Go
Pacific
ahead.
islands and coastal airfields, was starkly different. American industrial capacity, combined with technological innovation, had created a weapon whose impact extended far beyond the fuselage and wings. It reshaped strategy, morale, and the very psychology of combat. In the human dimension, the shock experienced by Japanese pilots, engineers, and commanders reminds us that war is not won on paper alone. Courage and skill, though vital, must operate within the framework of resources and production. The engineer who once believed America had no aluminum faced the incontrovertible proof that assumptions, however logical, can be fatal when confronted with reality. For American pilots and planners, the Mustang embodied the synthesis of vision, discipline, and execution, a triumph of human ingenuity applied at scale. Strategically, the Mustang's dominance accelerated the Allies' path to air superiority. Long-range bombing missions became increasingly effective, defensive doctrines crumbled, and Japan's ability to contest the skies diminished irreversibly. This shift was not just a series of victories in the air, it was a transformation of the war itself, demonstrating that the capacity to produce, sustain, and innovate could determine outcomes as decisively as battlefield skill. Historically, the story of the Mustang reminds us that warfare is a convergence of technology, industry, leadership, and human perception. The lesson is timeless. Underestimating an opponent's resources, or overestimating one's own, carries consequences measured not just in machines lost, but in lives, morale, and strategic position. The glinting silver of Mustangs across the Pacific sky symbolized more than air power. It was a manifestation of industrial might, foresight, and the relentless momentum of a nation mobilized for total war. As the sun set over the islands and the last Mustangs returned to base, the lesson lingered. History is shaped not only by courage or strategy, but by the capacity to turn vision into reality. In that sky, filled with aircraft born of aluminum, engines, and human ingenuity, the world witnessed a truth both simple and profound. The future of war belonged to those who could produce, innovate, and endure, relentlessly, unmistakably, and on a scale no opponent could ignore.